My name's Tom Lancaster. I'm Head of Land, Seas and Climate Policy at the RSPB. And the aim of the workshop today is really to explore the potential for nature-based solutions on farmland at every scale, as I said, and we'll be hearing from 4 speakers who I'll introduce shortly from around the world about their experiences of incorporating nature-based solutions into their farms and onto the land that they manage. And then there'll be an opportunity for all of us to go into breakout groups and discuss a sort of series of questions, and then come together at the end just for 10 minutes to reflect on all of the sort of feedback that we've given and discussion that we've had in those breakout groups. So as you all know, climate change is perhaps the greatest long-term threat that wildlife and people face. The continuing decline of nature is exacerbated by and accelerating climate change. And we must protect nature better if we are to tackle climate change, but it also provides a huge opportunity for farmers and land managers to address both the climate and nature emergencies in tandem. So at the RSPB, we define sort of nature-based solutions to climate change as the ways that nature can help us mitigate climate breakdown by locking up and storing huge amounts of carbon, and also to support nature in the way that it needs to adapt to climate change. Nature-based solutions could help provide around 25% of the global climate change mitigation every year that we need to get to the Paris Accord target of 1.5 degree Celsius target by 2050. And although farming is often portrayed as a sort of problem in the context of biodiversity decline and climate change, actually farming must also be the solution to these twin emergencies, and farmers from across the globe have a central role to play. So nature-based solutions are obviously rising up the agenda, and we are sort of absolutely convinced at the RSPB that on-farm solutions, from margin to mountain, as the title of the talk of the session sort of suggests, have a really important part to play. And that's not just about capturing greenhouse gas emissions, it's about enriching wildlife, increasing resilience of farm businesses, and every farmer everywhere, from our perspective, has a part to play. So why are we here today? So this workshop gives us space for farmers and everyone else who's interested. Everyone has a stake in this issue, to come together and discuss the potential of nature-based solutions, and also some sort of practical ideas and solutions that we can all help to adopt. We'll have a series of presentations, as I suggested, from sort of farmers and land use specialist land managers from around the world, to set the stage for some deeper discussions that we can then have in those breakout groups. So if I just segue to some brief introductions. So firstly, I'm joined by several RSPB colleagues, so I won't run through. They will introduce themselves in the breakout groups, and they'll be helping to facilitate those discussions. But really glad to be joined by 4 excellent speakers who have generously given their time. So firstly, we're joined by Bridget Murphy, who's a hill farmer and land use specialist from County Sligo in Ireland. So Bridget is a long-time sort of land rights advocate and feminist, and has lived on and farmed mountain land for nearly 20 years, with experience of farming in South Africa around Ireland. She keeps a flock of 20 Cheviot sheep, 4 hill ponies, an apiary of native black bees, and manages heath and blanket bog, and has been working for the last decade to re-wet sections of her farm. So Bridget believes that we need to broaden the understanding of what productivity is, and include products like habitats, clean air and water, carbon sequestration, and the protection of carbon stores. Secondly, we're joined by Dr. Irina Herzon from Finland. So Irina holds a degree in biology and a PhD in agroecology. She focuses on providing information and understanding of ecological land use practices to farmers, and has helped advise the BirdLife Agriculture Task Force for many years. And her own family farm is a beef farm in southern Finland, and is the largest manager of coastal pastures in the region. So great to be joined by Irina. Thirdly, we've got George Young, known to many of you as Farming George on Twitter, who's an agroecological farmer from Essex in England. He's currently working to increase crop diversity and reduce artificial inputs, and move to circular farming and provision of wildlife habitats on his farm in Essex, and produce as much and as diverse a range of nutrition and fibre as possible, with loads of interconnected areas of nature on the farm. And then finally, we have Asina K. Jane, superintendent at the Gola Rainforest, conservation cocoa farm in Sierra Leone. So the Gola Cocoa team have supported farmers with training in agroforestry, whereby cocoa trees are strategically planted alongside leafy shade trees, nitrogen fixing trees for soil fertility, bushes of pineapples and chili peppers. And this is a really important biodiversity hotspot that supports endangered species, including pygmy hippos, forest elephants and chimpanzees, and 300 species of bird and 600 butterfly species. So I think Asenia has by far and away the sort of top trumps when it comes to wildlife, I suspect, and he'll be our fourth speaker. So without further ado, I'll ask Bridget to just give a 5-minute talk on her experience.
Yeah, not a problem. Thank you very much for the introduction, Tom, and thanks for the invite to participate today. So I take an ecosystems approach, which means looking at and understanding the living system within which the land is situated, and then working with nature's methods to bring it beyond sustainable to resilient and thriving. Before I explore some of the nature-based solutions I use on the land, I'll quickly identify the ecosystems and assess the basics of the climate, soil health, habitat, and groundwater quality, because understanding where I am and what I'm working with is essential for any intervention. So my farm is situated on the northwestern seaboard of the Republic of Ireland, on the edge of the Ox Mountains. And as can be seen from the snapshot of the North Atlantic jet stream, the prevailing conditions are generally a conveyor belt of wet and windy weather coming in from the southwest. Climate disruption sees more rain, heavier showers, and more intense storms. Our temperatures don't fluctuate greatly between summer and winter due to the Gulf Stream, and occasionally it doesn't rain for a few weeks, at which point our lower lands start experiencing drought conditions. My 125-acre farm is roughly divided into a quarter of lower green fields, a quarter of mountain that is privately owned, and then the remainder is an undivided share of the Dramard commonage. As you can see, the soil types on my lower green fields, you have shallow, well-drained mineral soil. And on the higher mountain land, there's blanket peat and shallow, well-drained mineral soil. The condition of the mountain soils and vegetation, on my owned land, the condition is quite good. On the shared commonage, it's not that good. I find it handy to use the results-based scorecards that have been developed by different high nature value groups to establish a baseline and to allow for monitoring progress. So looking at the conditions of my greener fields, which are multi-species permanent pasture, and again, it's handy to use the scorecards to establish a baseline, I would score the condition as quite poor. My land is pretty much sheep sick. It needs more internal fencing to allow for more holistic managed grazing. This fencing, when I can finally afford it, will also create nature corridors for wildlife. Investment in infrastructure has been difficult. I inherited the farm with an extremely narrow lane, no electricity, no house, no sheds or handling facilities, and very basic fencing on the boundaries. Looking now at assessing water and water quality, in the little black circles there, you can see the Barnabrack source comes off the mountain. The quality of the water source is good, and the Water Framework Directive risk status is currently under review. So now that we have an idea of the ecosystem and its quality or condition, we can look to what nature-based climate actions I'm using. Just to remind us, the aim of my interventions is to see all the ecosystems thriving, allowing nature herself then to regenerate and to assert resilience. I understand that thriving ecosystems create habitat and food, and with that different species come. And I also understand that there are additional outcomes to these interventions that provide public goods or services, essentially new products, for example, carbon sequestration, carbon storage, and flood mitigation. I'm always mindful, though, of two key principles. Firstly, the CAP for Nature principle of quality, quantity, and connectivity matter. And secondly, start with the soil and the rest will follow. I'm sure by now everyone is well familiar with the soil food web and the importance of restoring soil health. Once that's in place, soil fertility regenerates. So, looking at specific actions now, on my greener fields to the right, I'm focusing on building this healthy soil food web in the multi-species permanent pasture. The fields already have a very, very good coverage of white clover. On the left, onto the mountainside, I've allowed the boggy land that was drained back in the late 1960s and 70s, and you can see the scars of the drains across the land, to re-wet and to regenerate. An ancestor lined all of the watercourses and some of the fields about 200 years ago, and I'm filling gaps that have emerged over the years. The trees stabilize the banks as well as providing a valuable nature corridor. As many of the trees in the corridors are ash, replacements are also being planted to anticipate losses due to ash dieback. I'm planting native woodland or agroforestry on the lower green land, that's the purple circles, and putting in more dense clusters of trees and plants that fruit, nut, or berry for wildlife food and habitat. Those would be the red circles. I've also planted 2 small orchards of cherries, pears, plums, cooking, very importantly, cider and eating apples. I have 3 apiaries of native black bees, and I'm mindful to ensure that there's sufficient feed for wild pollinators as well as managed bees. The apiaries are separated into clusters to reduce the risk and spread of disease. I've seeded a small field with meadow, herb, and wildflowers to provide food for the bees and also to provide a source of seed for spreading into other areas on the farm. I've started experimenting with silt traps along some of the streams to try and harvest some of the sand that's being lost in the time of heavy showers and rainfall.
That's just one minute left or so, Bridget.
Yeah. I've begun experimenting using old growth heather and downed wood for making biochar. This is mixed with manure and inoculated compost before being spread out in the spring. This year, I'm also experimenting with sprouting barley as an addition or an alternative for feeding hay over the winter. In years where it's possible to save good hay or haylage, I do that, but the wet conditions, the compaction, and the continued cutting of the same hay meadow is putting strain on the soil health in that field. So exploring options has become necessary. And then finally, something particularly important to me, I harvest annually and keep a seed collection that includes trees, wildflowers, green manure, herbs, and vegetables. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Bridget. Really interesting. As I said, we're sort of collecting questions as we go, so we'll put those to Bridget alongside the rest of our speakers at the end. So if we move swiftly on to Irina, Irina, if you could, give your talk.
You should be able to see my screen. Okay, yeah, good. So I'm taking you to quite a different corner of the world. So Finland is the country with the northernmost agriculture in the world. So it sets quite a different context to what is possible and what can be done. There are 3 issues I would like you to take from the context. First is that agriculture is only 7% of the country's land area. So very often it is highly fragmented, as you see in the landscape where our farm is situated, though there are some regions in Finland with much more homogeneous open land area, but trees generally are not a rarity in this country. There is a lot of forest, and each farm basically has about half of the land in forest. And then there is a lot of water, coastal waters, and lots of lakes and rivers. In our case, this is a river that drains into the sea bay, so the Baltic Sea. And that also sort of sets very important sort of preconditions of what can be done in order to protect the waters. So the farm is about 800 hectares, which is quite large by Finnish standards, half and half as typically is in Finland, forest and arable land. Over 100 hectares are under natural or semi-natural pastures. So in our case, this is sea coast meadows, which in Europe are often called high nature value farmlands. And that's because of their exceptional, like exquisite biodiversity values, which cannot be found on other types of farmland. And the main production line is beef, which is not typical for Finland. Most of animal farming in Finland is dairy, and then of course specialized crop farms. The solutions that are feasible for a commercial enterprise and the farm is kind of economically viable, I listed a few. The first and foremost important, I think, is the use of permanent and in our case semi-natural pastures. And this is because in Finland, basically all grassland that is in use as pastures and fodder is rotational. So every 5th year it is rotated into arable, into crop field. So very little is permanent. And especially those semi-natural pastures are extremely rare these days. About 40,000 hectares survive up to now. So these are among the most endangered communities in the whole country to begin with. So what our farm is doing is grazing cattle on both sides of the bay. All animals are there on the semi-natural pastures all summer, which is very short in Finland, 3 months about. So the benefits are, of course, carbon storage, because on permanent pastures, it's quite different from rotational. And then the animals that graze on those non-field areas around water courses, they basically build up, convert nutrients into their muscles and therefore return them back on land. Baltic Sea is one of the most polluted, eutrophied, enclosed seas. And then by this, we also reduce competition for arable land so that we don't use good arable land for having animals on it. They can quite happily use non-arable land for food. And as I mentioned, unique biodiversity, this bay is in Natura 2000 site, and also what we call in Finland traditional heritage biotope, which is kind of cherished in Finland. It looks a bit like this, quite pleasing as you can see. And what animals are doing, they're grazing both sides of this sea bay, hugely important for migrating birds, but also some of the forests, which is again a traditional practice in the boreal zone, but I think across all Europe, animals used to graze forests. So several parts of forests are also sort of, as you can call it, agroforestry. They're wooded pastures. And many rare species of plants and invertebrates and animals and other animals live. And this is a recent arrival from last year, a very successful nest of a sea eagle on the farm. Now, the second most important solution, I think, is that all forests of the farm are non-clear cut. So it's continuous cover forestry together with their company that specializes on it. And since in Finland forestry is a major land use type, imagine what would happen to like biodiversity and carbon storage if all clear cuts would be converted into a forest like this. There's a lot of research coming up on benefits of this type of forestry, and it's very new in Finland. Not very perhaps important for climate, but still here we have several field corners set aside as so-called game and nature management fields. They're mainly good for biodiversity, for pollinators, for birds, for some of the plants. And they're fallowed minimum 2 years, but you can extend it for longer. And last summer, we also started to trial rotational grazing under national projects. There are possible benefits of increased carbon sequestration, but I would like to remind you it's not as certain because this is a rotational pasture. So once it's blown up, some of the carbon, of course, will be released. And also in Finland, most of soils, like here, are clay. They're very high in soil organic content to begin with. So we'll see whether this rotational grazing brings any additional benefit. It does bring a lot of additional workload and a lot of also petrol use for moving cattle from place to place in a very fragmented landscape. So not all solutions probably are all that good in all situations. But the last,
Irina.
Yes, last slide is, I think, very important. Our farm is the only one with animal production farm, commercial enterprise that also is open to people, anyone, whether they buy or not. They can come and follow self-guided nature trails and learn about what we do and how we do and why we do. And also many groups, including decision makers, other farmers, public generally come to see the farm and talk to us. And we also have the main message to all our customers is do eat less meat, because meat is ecologically a very expensive product. There are very good ecological laws wise, so you can't avoid it. So do eat less meat, but if you eat it, buy from enterprises like ours. So be kind of mindful about what kind of animal products you consume. And I think this is also very important, nature-based solution, because meat is not our main food in the human evolution. And that's all from me.
Thanks very much, Irina. Really interesting. So moving swiftly on, if we go to George in Essex.
Cool, thank you very much. I'm just going to sort out my screen share quickly.
I think we're still seeing Irina's. If you can.
Oh, sorry, I need to stop share here.
Oh, there you go.
Does that work?
Yep. Yeah,
cool.
That's great.
Lovely, lovely, lovely. Thank you. Cool. So good afternoon, everybody, and thanks very much for joining. I am George Young, aka Farming George, and you can find me with that handle on all the social medias. So I just want to take a second at the start to define agroecology, which is the most important thing informing how I farm. It's hugely important how I think about biodiversity loss. It can be split into three really simple points. The first one is farming with nature. The second one is circular farming, whereby essentially any waste products are retained on the farm, converted into secondary products, and then utilized on the farm. And then the third one is engaging the local community in the farm with a special focus on food sovereignty. Now, the reason I mention biodiversity loss is because I actually fervently believe that if we tackle ecosystem collapse rather than focusing on climate change, we're going to have better results. So yes, obviously we need to stop our reliance on fossil fuels, but on the whole, I think that's more of an issue for other industries. They're the ones who are going to be making our tractors electric after all. But by making changes on farm, which make for a more diverse, rich, natural environment, we are naturally going to have tackled a lot of necessary issues, which are going to really help to mitigate climate as well. So I spend a fair amount of time planning on Google Earth, which I'm sure many of you, also do the same. It's a really fantastic resource. But what's really great about it is being able to go back in time. Unfortunately, Google only goes back to 1999, which isn't especially handy. However, if you Google old OS map overlay or something along those lines, there's a website which is NLS, and you can find this tool, which I've got on the right, which enables you to grab old OS maps and then essentially overlay them on top of Google Earth images, which is what I've done here. And the really cool thing is, I mean, this map I've chosen here kind of shows some of the old field boundaries. This is from sort of 1880, but it also shows some of the old features like the rills that used to be present on my marshes. And this can be super handy in forming some of the changes you might want to make on your farm when you're thinking about reintroducing habitat. Now, as it happens, I've got a little bit of a peculiar farm in this regard. Up until the late 1800s, half of my farm, the half on the right, was tidal, and then they built a seawall, and in the mid 20th century there was a barrier put in to prevent flooding on Canvey Island. So consequently, there is no kind of specific habitat that my farm should revert to. So I don't really have anything that I can kind of call on to inform me of what I should be doing. So I like to have a little bit of fun when I'm planning what I'm doing. And that's kind of where this image comes in. So, so obviously taking a Google Earth image and playing around with it and sketching on it as to ways that I can kind of really kind of bring extra stuff into my farm and make it a more exciting farm. So one of the major points from a biodiversity standpoint is ensuring that wildlife can safely traverse my farm in areas that are consistently never disturbed by machinery. And this is where this wild seam comes in. Now I've got a little bit of a wild seam anyway on my seawall I mentioned earlier, because that's no longer got anything tidal happening on it. It goes really wild and has gone nice and overgrown now. And if I can manage that now with pigs and with cattle, there are some really exciting ecological gains that come in there. But the main purpose, going back to this field itself, the main purpose here is to provide like exceptionally high animal welfare, specifically for cows, whereby essentially we've got these really wide silver pasture belts. So they're about 15 meters wide. That's my plan, which are going to act as shelter and additional forage for the cows, but whilst also having incredible ecological gains and sequestering a ton of carbon. And what's more, I'll also be coppicing them, which is an even better way to ensure you're sequestering carbon. You can't just plant a tree and sequester carbon. You have to plant trees, let them grow, cut them down, and they'll grow again. And then the alleys in between these trees are going to feature really super diverse swards of permanent pasture. At the moment, they're in a diverse sward of a 4-year herbal lay. But in and of those themselves, those permanent pastures, when mob grazed, are also obviously fantastic for carbon sequestration and really feature some amazing ecological gains. Anyway, like I said, that's a project for next year. At the moment, I've all but finished planting my first 50-acre field of agroforestry. And since introducing agroecological techniques such as this, plus the eradication of insecticides and the really severe reduction of other synthetic inputs on my farm, the uptick in insect, small mammal and bird life is nothing short of exceptional here in Fobbing. And I got to say, it feels so amazing to hear the excitement from twitchers and wildlife nuts when they come here and visit. So I really can't wait for these trees to establish and see the next phase of ecological gains that I've achieved here in Fobbing. But anyway, that's been me. Thanks very much for listening, and I hope you enjoyed it. I'll look forward to any questions later on.
Perfect, and perfectly to time. Thanks very much, George. So last but not least, we go to Asina Kejane in Sierra Leone to talk about his experience there growing cocoa.
All right. What I will do shortly, I will share the presentation after, and why the questions come. I am Asina Kejane from Sierra Leone, a very small country in West Africa, working for Gola Rainforest National Park. The Gola Rainforest National Park is the last remain of the upper forest running through Sierra Leone and Liberia. Running through Sierra Leone and Liberia. And we have been working closely with communities around the Gola Rainforest National Park, about 122 communities. And in these communities, the main aim is to at least bring together these patches of forest, because the Gola Rainforest itself is divided into 3 patches. We have the Gola North, the Gola Central, and that of the Gola South, through a cocoa rehabilitation activity. Upon that, we realized that maintaining or improving the national park could be a very important step, but equally extending it to communities and their forests could be a way moving forward to mitigate climate change and maintaining the forest biodiversity. On that note, there are a lot of activities being put in place for correcting those things. For example, the cocoa activity, the cocoa rehabilitation activity came as a result of improving the livelihood of communities and equally helping in the conservation of nature in those areas. So, as our saying goes, nature is amazing, therefore we should give it a home. With that, farmers have been organized into groups, and the Gola landscape itself has got up to 70,000 hectares, and with a total number of 1,743 farmers across 4 chiefdoms at the moment, because the whole Gola landscape entails 7 chiefdoms: Koya, Bari, Nomo, Makpeli, Gaura, Tunkia, and Malema. So we are presently operating in Tunkia, Koya, Malema, and Gaura, with the hope of extending to the rest of the other chiefdoms. So there are a lot of activities, in which these farmers were aggregated for, like the forest-friendly production of cocoa, wherein it will discourage the slash and burn method. That's the ancient method, which will give them the zeal to improve on their current farms instead of expanding or establishing new farms every year, which will be highly economical at the end of the day, because farmers will not be able to cater for all the different farms in different locations, but rather improving on the existing farms with all good agricultural practices, to making sure that that farm gives you bumper harvest instead of patch farms with very low yield, which will bring income. So from that time to now, we have realized that the cocoa farms are serving as a corridor for the existing biodiversity, which is very interactive, wherein you get the white neck picatitis, the chimpanzees, with lots of other species, which are using the Gola cocoa farms as corridor for interaction into communities, which is very good for biodiversity and climate change. So with that, from 2016 to now, we have exported up to 8 containers of cocoa, which is bringing income and involving the farmers, because it is a sustainable crop production and income yielding, which is equally involving women in all these activities, because there is a whole gender aspect of it, which involve women, to be part of the process, and equally discouraging child labor, because that has been a very big challenge. But with the existing child labor policies in the farmer associations, has helped greatly in reducing that, because they have child labor officers.
Just 1 minute left, Asina.
Yeah. Hello?
Sorry, I was just giving you your 1 minute warning.
So, like in the forest now, just from the community now to the forest, there is this methodology put in place for forest zoning, wherein communities are equally encouraged to harvest non-timber forest products from this forest, so that that will be used in their communities or for income. So thank you for listening. I'm looking forward to your questions and comments.
Thanks very much, Asina. That's really interesting. So if we move quickly then on to so we've got about 7 or 10 minutes or so for questions. So about 15's on the go here. So if we go to maybe one for going back to the beginning, one for Bridget first. So there's a question here, Bridget, for how are your interventions being funded, and do you view food production as a key source of income, either now or going forward?
Great. Well, I fund them myself. It's certainly not done in terms of any project or scheme or that. And in terms of food production, yes, at the moment I keep sheep. It's, I suppose, a wee bit odd. It's certainly under the land eligibility criteria for the cap payments that we get. I have to keep a certain livestock density on the mountains. Although I would very much like to reduce the number of sheep and increase the number of bees and kind of take it in that direction, take it into looking at seed production. You know, George talks about the herbal leys and you know, the seeds that need to go into those pastures to start diversifying the species. In Ireland, to access seed like that, we importing it in from Germany. It's absolutely crazy that we're not generating it on the mountains. So I would kind of like to start looking at generating seed in conjunction with the bees and kind of stepping away a bit from the sheep. But that's more sort of my personal approach or perspective to it.
Great, thank you, Bridget. And then one from Maya for Sinu. Has it been easy, Sinu, in Gola to persuade local farmers to move towards nature-friendly cocoa production?
Well, it has been very challenging, more especially changing the mentality of farmers from the crude way of farming to that of a modern and more beneficial way of farming for you and the entire community and the wider world has been very challenging. But bringing farmers together, doing it with them has been our major breakthrough methodology we used, because we used them in every step we take, that including them into the activities rather than doing it for them. You know, that has helped us greatly.
Brilliant, thank you. And then one for George here, why are your trees wavy rather than straight, George?
So my current agroforestry scheme is straight, and that was me trying to essentially prove a point to more conventionally minded farmers as to how you can kind of quite easily farm with trees. But I'm on the cusp of converting to organic, or some land is in organic conversion. And very simply, it looks a lot prettier if you can't see straight down the line. And also by having those waves, it means you have that degree of slightly closed in feeling rather than it just feeling like an open thing, and it stops the wind whistling through quite the same. So it's just trying to create something a little bit closer to a natural habitat.
Great. And then for Irina, in terms of the grasslands that you had around the bay, are those grasslands salt marsh? And then the sort of second one was, how does the soil carbon change throughout the grazing rotation?
Sorry, the connection was not ideal. How does the soil carbon change throughout
the sort of grazing rotation?
Well, I don't know. That's not studied in Finnish conditions yet. We don't know. We want to know, because, as I say, this is a rotational pasture also. So it will stay only for 5 years, and then it's blown up under crop.
And the first one was, are the grasslands salt marsh at all?
Yes, you can say it's a brackish waters. So it's very close to the sea, around the sea, but it's quite a narrow bay inland. So it's a brackish water, but drinkable by cows.
Okay. We probably have the right time for another quick round if people are, if we get short answers. So for you, Bridget, how did you re-wet the bog? Did you block the drains or just simply not maintain them?
Yeah, when I first started up, I mean, I was pointed out that the drains, you know, needed to be unblocked, and I sent a digger up there, and it was just absolutely crazy. So In part, the higher ones, I allowed, those drains had already collapsed, and what I did was I allowed them to remain collapsed. And then the lower drains, I just used sods and allowed it to back itself up. So there was a combination there of intervention and nature just intervening herself.
Okay. And then a quick one for Asina. Do you have any sort of special added value market for your cocoa, Asina? Do the farmers get a premium for it?
At the moment, the cocoa is fair trade certified. The farmers are fair trade certified, and before the fair trade certification, the cocoa has been sold to a diversified market, more especially craft market. You know, because we go in for the highest bidder for the cocoa because of its quality and the farmers that are producing, more especially the location it is coming from. So that is where the farmers have been making some income. And moving forward, we are equally.
And then maybe one.
Yeah. So moving forward, we are equally going for organic certification.
Okay. And then one final question, perhaps for Irina, just a sort of practical one. You mentioned having to move wires every day. Had you considered using sort of electric fenced fixed paddocks instead?
Oh, they are electrically fenced, but because they're fragmented, the parcels, it's not one area that is subdivided. There are several pastures. So in many cases, it's like moving cattle over the road or along the road to another pasture. That means a lot of, like a couple of tractors to block accesses and dogs and people shouting and all these things. It's just too laborious. And before we know that it actually pays back in ecological benefits, I a bit wonder whether many farmers will start doing it. We need more research to show that it works. And also on soils that are already rich in organic matter.
Yeah.
I think rotational grazing works better on lighter soils, at least to my understanding.
And then maybe we can squeeze in one final one that Patrick has just asked of George. What's your reason, George, for converting to organic?
There's quite a few reasons. One of them is just from a kind of market perspective. It's expected that with what I'm doing, I should be organic. But also, I really hate what pesticides are doing. And I actually think that kind of provided you've got enough permanent habitat that isn't disturbed, I'm only going to be disturbing probably about 30% of my farm every year. And that's only going to be very minimal disturbance at a very short period of the year. So I think that's a better solution, just to entirely cut those pesticides, because after all of them are killing something. I'd rather not kill anything on my farm.
Okay, good note to end that discussion on. So what we're going to do now is just go into breakout groups for around probably 30 minutes or so, probably coming back at about 1:15, which will give us then 10 minutes to just feed back. So you will be randomly generated or randomly sort of split into breakout groups, and then there'll be a sort of facilitator. I think looking at the numbers on the call, it should be around 5 or so people per group. So I will hand that over to Maya and Bella, our ORFC volunteer, to see whether and see you all in half an hour. So there's lots here in terms of the examples of farmland nature-based solutions, in terms of planting hedgerows, changing in grazing management to improve the quality of permanent pasture, rewetting of bogs and creation of wood pasture. A couple of specific examples around planting woodland at Ullswater in Cumbria, and also tall grass sort of regenerative farming on Orkney. I don't know if any of the people who know about those two specific examples wanted to comment on those at all. There's no pressure to do so, obviously.
Yeah, I'm happy to. I'm up in Cumbria and I'm working with Danny Teasdale, who runs Ullswater CIC, on a few things. So he, after the 2015 Beast from the East created the really horrendous flooding in Ullswater, he met all his farmer neighbours in Ullswater catchment to set up a collaborative vision of planting woodland, hedgerows, using regenerative grazing, mob grazing of sheep, and anything to reduce the impact of flooding. That was the main kind of aim initially, and it's expanded beyond that. He now is taken on to re-meander rivers all over catchments. He acts as an advisor to set up other farmer groups. So yeah, it's just one of those examples where he's been self-organised and has just cracked on no matter what anyone else sort of thinks, and has brought loads of farmers along with him. So
yeah, that's really great, and it's one of my favourite Twitter accounts actually.
He's great, yeah.
Bit of inspiration.
Yeah.
To break up your doom scrolling. Any other comments on sort of examples of nature-based solutions that people wanted to sort of reference or bring to life for the group? Again, there's no compulsion.
Well, I want to highlight one which we found working quite well in our conditions, at least with our customers, and we have over 1,000 customers who come and buy our beef, is that when we openly say to people that do eat less meat, but then buy better quality, we gain trust from them, because we're not pushing even more meat on them, like any meat. Especially with young customers, it really buys well, because meat is then like global level of consumption is definitely not sustainable. And as my husband jokes, we're the largest seller of beef to vegetarians, because typically a wife is vegetarian, but then she buys this kind of good meat, better meat for her boys, growing children or husband. And I think we should be quite honest with the big challenge that domesticated animals have on biodiversity and climate.
Yeah, okay, so you must be doing something right, Irina, if you're selling beef to vegetarians.
Could I make a comment? Sorry, it's Tom here. I don't have a video capability on this arable farmer in Cambridgeshire. One of the things I think is really valuable is collaborative work between farmers, and that's, I mean, people know about that, and being able to create wildlife corridors and joining groups of people doing this sort of work produces better outcomes for biodiversity and wildlife. But actually, alongside that, and I chair our cluster group, and we've got sort of 10,000 hectares represented in our cluster group. But alongside that, I think it's just a great forum for bringing everyone along. The farmers that are likely to drag their feet, or probably closer to retirement, or just it's a lot of hassle. They've got a lot on their plate, and just that sort of collective ability to learn together how to do do things that improve biodiversity, improve carbon sequestration, improve the way we're farming, is absolutely fantastic to see. So I strongly recommend it if you have an opportunity to link up with local farmers. I know it's not always easy, but it can really reap rewards.
Thanks, Tom. Well, actually, one of the sort of post-it notes on here is about community land use planning, and I wondered, Asinu, with your experience in Gola, with, I think you said 1,400 farms, how have you managed to bring together that many farmers? I think he might have frozen. Asinu, did you hear that?
No, it was broken.
I was just wondering how you managed to pull off the community land use planning that you had around Gola.
Well, is engaging the stakeholders you know, the youths and the women, because these communities, the land owning systems are different. So the first target is the farmer groups we are using. That those were the first people we all discussed, and they led us to the community leaders and market. Some communities were able to even demarcate some plot of land which they want to keep as their own reserve for the future, which is very important. So those were the steps we took to reaching that point.
Thank you. So moving on to the sort of what would you have liked to have done but haven't been able to. Did anyone want to sort of bring anything out here? There's lots of stuff about building local markets for regenerative food, fragmented farms, meaning that you weren't able to work with your neighbours as effectively as possible. Any sort of particular issues that people wanted to highlight to the group here? I wondered, to put you on the spot, Bridget, how have you found it in Sligo working with your neighbours? Because you mentioned you had a large area of commonage. How have you got on with your neighbours working there?
I was at a conference a couple of years ago, and a fellow from Scotland described the Irish commonages as like trying to herd cats. And there it is, you know. It's particularly difficult on the commonage, and that's why, as I've mentioned, my lower fields are sheep sick, because the density of the sheep that I have to keep are kept mostly down on the greener fields, because using the commonage is quite difficult. I'd say there's gender issues there. There's long-term ideas, you know. I mean, the commonages were divided up kind of like back, say, for example, 1900s to 1920s. And stronger families kind of just took over. I mean, obviously you're seeing a lot of land abandonment on commonages in some of the remote areas, but in a lot of the other areas, stronger people just take it over and the smaller people have been pushed out the way. So, I mean, there's a lot of issues around tenure, around being able to access and use your land, and how we actually even learn to share land is something that still needs to be put on the agenda.
Okay. Any sort of further reflections on that sort of point about what people would have liked to have done but haven't been able to? Do just jump in if you want to. And then we had a sort of question about barriers to embracing nature-based solutions on farmland. There's lots here in terms of advice, skilled labour, sort of cultural traditions and assumptions about what land is for. Again, to put one of our speakers on the spot, George, you are often quite outspoken in terms of the farming industry and its approach to things. Do you view that sort of the cultural assumptions about what farmers are for as a major barrier still?
Yeah, well, we had a really interesting discussion here, not necessarily about from a farm perspective, but this idea that a lot of people think landscape, what it looked like between 50 and 100 years ago, is what landscape should therefore consequently look like. So obviously this is land which is massively overgrazed by sheep, and land that's not being able to regenerate. And there are plenty of articles in the press complaining about sheep being banned from land and how it's historically always looked like it has with sheep. And of course it hasn't. And we really need to change those preconceptions and get the powers that be to understand that just because that land looks like that now doesn't mean it should always look like that. Nature is this constantly changing thing. And yeah, we had a really interesting discussion about that. And I think it's a really key thing that we need to change for people to understand that nature is scruffy and land shouldn't look like it should look. And we need to let some of these areas really scrub up and go pretty wild.
Great, thanks, George. Any sort of comments on any of that or any of the other sort of barriers or other issues that people have identified in that discussion?
Well, in our group, one of the key barriers was mentioned time of producers. We're kind of having so many expectations from farmers, but they're only people. They have to know how to manage land and animals, and now also biodiversity, and think of climate and market and fill in all the forms, etc., etc. It's just too much. And on our farm, the farm itself nearly got bankrupt, but then my family, we are urban people, but we brought the necessary capital to rescue the farm. And also my husband now does the catering and tourism and this marketing side of the thing. So the farmer family does the actual farming. So the merging, like trying to put together people who complement the skills and capacities is what is very much needed, but it's much lacking. In Finland, at least, many family farms go out of business. They got bankrupt rather than share, because that's my land. I don't want outsiders, but the times changed.
Yeah, okay. And then finally, one of the final pages was around opportunities, either practical or for policy. And there's lots here around focusing on local food, as we've seen during the COVID pandemic. Lots of stuff about seeing practical examples in action, which we've obviously seen a lot of today, working with neighbours and coordinating between farmers. So whilst we've heard a bit there about some of the challenges to that, there's obviously lots of really great stuff happening across the UK and around the world in that space, which is really exciting and something to build on. We are out of time because someone else needs to use this Zoom account for a follow-on workshop, as is the way of the world. So I just wanted to all of our speakers, so Asina Farming George, Bridget Murphy and Irina Herzon. Thanks Bella for helping with the tech, and in my team for helping organise this, and all of the facilitators, and of course all of you for coming and sort of joining in the discussions. There's no sort of follow-on necessarily. This was just to try and share information and knowledge and prompt sort of discussion about the role of nature-based solutions on farmland from margin to mountain. And we hope that we've done that today, and that you've had sort of valuable conversations. And yeah, just leaves it me to say thanks very much. Be well, be safe, and here's to a better 2021. Thanks very much for coming.